Hello. Yes, we are on. Good morning. Hi, everyone. Is the mic on? I think so. So we have some change of schedule we have to make. We are going to start with session 6, which is targeted and responsive fiscal policy, and we're being very responsive given the need of change of schedule. So we are very tuned in, and we are going to go from now 10 to 11:30. Right? We'll have lunch from 11:30 to 12:30, and then we'll come back, have session 5 originally on growth strategies in a climate change world, and then we continue from there with the session 7 at 2 and so on. Hope that's okay. So as I said, this is a session on target and responsive fiscal policy. My name is, I didn't say who I am. I'm Laura Abramovsky. I'm a research associate here at ODI. I'm also a research fellow at the Institute for Fiscal Studies in London. And over the course of this conference, we heard a lot about the tight fiscal conditions most countries are facing in the context of the poly crisis. And we heard a lot about what the poly crisis is yesterday. We also heard about the need of governments to respond with fiscal instruments to rising poverty, income inequality, uncertainty, and shocks, particularly to the climate change, but at the same time considering long-term objectives of transitioning to greener, earth-friendly economies, and an international global order that considers better social and intertemporal cost of carbon technologies that are more inclusive, provide a more equal chance of fully participating in society for all individuals. And I would also add that includes more women and girls on an equal footing. Fiscal policies is one of many instruments the governments have to achieve these goals, but it is an important one, and how these instruments are designed matter a lot. And during the COVID-19 pandemic, some governments were better able to respond at speed and scale than others. Particularly lower income countries were not so well placed to respond because they lacked the resources and the capabilities to deliver a policy response. But it's important to know that there have been differences in responses across countries, even within income country groups and across regions, depending on the pre-crisis fiscal systems and capabilities, their political will, and their social preferences and contracts. Furthermore, in the context of tight budgets, the design of targeted policy seems increasingly relevant since universal measures are too costly. So that's what this session is about, how to bring policy and policy design and delivery closer together. What are the capabilities and institutional arrangements we need to respond in a more targeted and effective way? I'm delighted to be joined by a truly global all-star panel, no pressure, who have spent their career thinking about these issues and implementing solutions. So we have Yamini Ayar. She's the president and chief executive of the Center for Policy Research, India's premier institute for research and analysis on fiscal policy. We have Mike Bracken. He's the UK's first executive director of digital and chief data officer, founder of the government digital service, and now partner at Public Digital. And we also have 2 expert practitioners and policymakers from Ethiopia. Here in person, we have Hanhahun Beleu, who is the disaster risk finance workstream lead for Oxford Policy Management in Ethiopia, and he works and is representing, he's not here online, but he's representing Meskebu Amaterefe, who served as the director of fiscal policy in the Ministry of Finance for over a decade and is currently the senior fiscal policy advisor at the ministry. He wanted to join us today online, but he's very busy with an IMF mission, we were told. So he sent his apologies. but he's going to kick off the panel and provide us with an overview of how targeted and responsive fiscal policy has evolved in Ethiopia, the capabilities required to make it work, as well as their reflection on the success and ongoing challenges. Just to say, I was told to be very strict with timekeeping. So the idea is that I give you 10 minutes to each of you, and then we'll have a Q&A question session. So Fathan, over to you, please.
Thank you, Laura. On behalf of my colleague Mazgabu and myself, I would like to thank the organizers for giving us the opportunity to share my country, Ethiopia's productive safety net program overview, implementation, and sharing the experiences for others. Then I'll start by providing a very brief overview of the evolution of the PSNP program. The Productive Safety Net program is Ethiopia's flagship social protection program implementing since 2005, which provides a safety net to vulnerable populations. It has multiple objectives. One is actually smoothing the consumption of the rural poor. We know particularly with very chronic food insecurity. By providing cash and food, it promotes consumption of the rural poor. The second one is protecting asset depletion. We know when there is a crisis or shock, when there is a drought, the rural people are forced to sell their assets in order to secure their food. Then it protects actually the sale of their assets. It could be livestock and or others. The productive safety net not only provides food, it also encourages the rural poor to engage in some development activities, engaging in afforestation, watershed management, small-scale irrigation, and others. Then it has also the objective of engaging the rural population on development. At the same time, it also it promotes the environment protection and the climate change mitigation and adaptation activities. Then it has two components. One is the direct support. It provides direct food and particularly cash for those who are unable to engage in the public work activity. The other one is the public work activity, which is the larger share of the program. It requires those who are supported to engage in public works at a rural level. In fact, the rural PSNP was started in 2005, but it is the government expands this to the urban safety net program also, because there are also chronically food insecure population communities in the urban areas. Then, since 2016, it is implemented in 11 major cities in the country. It has also similar objective, actually, both on providing direct support and engaging in public works. The urban safety net, engaging the public work, has actually it's focused on urban areas, or particularly, we know that solid waste management is a problem in the major cities. Then there are those who are supported by the PSNP, the rural PSNP are required to work in solid waste management, in watershed management, urban agriculture, urban beautification development, and others. Over the last, as I said, since 2005, the government implemented 4 PSNP programs. Currently, the 5th one is being implemented, and from that's for 2021, 2025. Based on the previous experiences, the Productive Safety Net 5 program follows actually implemented or designed using these principles. The first one is focusing on extreme poverty and the most vulnerable. Previous PSNP programs are addressing particularly on food insecure communities. This one is the primary focus of the PSNP 5 is addressing the extreme poors. The other principle is fair and transparent client selection. It incorporates robust access in identifying and robust accountability and governance structures to implement the program. It has actually tries to put pre-arranged principles in how to select clients. Timely and predictable and appropriate or sufficient fund transfer. New mechanisms to enhance timelines of the transfer is introduced using automated payment systems to improve the quick transfer of funds for beneficiaries, including e-payment systems. It also try to, based on performance-based transfers and annual adjustment, two-way sale is also incorporated in the new PSNP program. Cash first principle is the other principle. This means, in the PSNP program, priority is given for cash transfer rather than giving food. Because in some areas there are foods the farmers are producing their products. Then if you add on that food, the market can be affected. Then in order to promote the local marketing, providing cash is preferable than food. Productive safety net, as the name is indicated, and as I've said earlier, it has productive or investment components in it. Then that's why it's called productive safety net, because it is included, as I said, other development activities in the rural area. It's integrated into local system. There is no parallel system required by the donors. Then it's used the existing financial PFM system and existing government staff. It has one objective, one strategic plan and result framework, one accountability mechanism, and one M&A system. There is also, it's used, for instance, the donors fund is using the World Bank multi-donor trust fund, and for the government, there is a pool fund system. Then it uses, it reduces the transaction cost actually. The other one is the scalable safety net in order to respond for crisis, which is, and the other one is gender equity and nutrition sensitivity, that mainstreaming gender, nutrition and social development, promoting the unique needs of women, children, and female headed families. It promotes women in decision-making process. These are the major principles when they designed the current PSNP 5. What is unique on the current PSNP 5 is there's a new way of working, that is addressing risk financing or addressing shocks. Then it enhances resilience to shocks of extreme poor and vulnerable in the rural household waradas, and it expands the geographic coverage of the PNSM in addressing drought-prone waradas. It enhances also the PSNP capacity to function as an integrated shock-responsive social safety net. That means established a pre-arranged rules of how to scale up responses during crisis. There is a credible and objective early warning system used to assess needs in order to respond quickly for the emerging crisis. The ability to scale up to address shocks is in two ways. That is horizontally by adding new beneficiaries, and vertically by promoting or additional assistance of existing process. Overall, PSNP differs from the previous five by adjusting targeting groups, expanding geographic areas, flexible, incorporating flexible addressing of crisis. Let me briefly show you the financing of the PSNP. As we see from this chart, 3 to 4% of total federal expenditure is allocated for PSNP. That is also about 6% of the GDP. Actual expenditure is below the planned one because and there is ups and downs erratic in the expenditure because the larger share is financed from donor finance. Then sometimes donor funds are not predictable. That's why we see ups and downs, and particularly in the recent years, the share of the expenditure is declining as funds flow from donors is declining. Okay, the other one here we see that the source of funds actually taking for 10 years data. As you see, the larger is financed from external assistance, 20% by domestic and 26% by loan. Government contribution is increasing, doubling for the last 3 years, as we see, from 70% to 35% for the last years. This shows that commitments by the government is increasing, and there is also unlikely financing of the external flows. On strengthening data management and information system, which is not actually mine, it's not that much. Yeah.
It's already 10 minutes.
10,
That's your,
am I finished?
10 minutes already, but yeah.
Okay, I will be fast on this. Actually, data management information system is very important for the program because there is a MIS system, IT support in MIS system that helps for management and operation, used also to manage beneficiaries' households data for targeting and to ensure timely, predictable, and adequate transfers. Also used for monitoring programs and delivery of fund transfers, allows users to access information, all users, both the donor and the government and other users, so users can access the information through that. Then promoting automatic payment, as I mentioned, improving the expansion of e-payments and help wage rate adjustments. There is a early warning dashboard which is trying to update the time 4 times per year in order to use pre-arranged financing. But this early warning dashboard or the early warning system is at its infant stage. There is a need to digitalize it and limit more promoting transparency and accountability. Then there is a need to support that in that area. There is an ongoing effort to address this weakness through implementing of IT-supported multi-hazard impact-based early warning roadmap. Let me give you a brief introduction for using how PSNP addresses or mitigates the impact of COVID-19. There are several rigorous evaluations showing that the PNP yielding positive results in addressing the household poverty and food insecurity during the pandemics. As you see from the right corner, there is one evidence. There are multiple other similar reviews which justify how PSNP helps the government or the community to mitigate the impact of COVID. Also, in addition, during the COVID time, government provides waiver for the public work and permission to make lump sum payment for that. The program also helps to strengthen behavioral change communication among the rural communities. Also, the program tries to install hand washing facilities and enhance availability of sanitary materials and others. Regularly adjustment of wage was done to mitigate the impact, and other and promoting automatic payment improvement, and using also for identifying most vulnerable in non-PSNP beneficiaries also. Just to give you some highlights, what lessons can draw from the implementation of PSNP in Ethiopia. Also, the objective of the government initially was to reduce number of beneficiaries through promoting development and resilience in the rural community. But due to the recent multiple crises, the need or the number of beneficiaries increased from 4 to 5% initially to now to 8 million persons with 480 waradas, which is 60% of the total waradas. We call them warada, the lower level structure. And it's making a meaningful contribution to reduce the reduction of rural poverty and food insecurity in normal times, and in response to shock due to its ability to scale up, as I mentioned earlier. Predictability of financing is was vital. Multi-year planning and financing with harmonized donor support from 9 donors. They are working in one system, and it is government-led, implemented through the existing system, as I mentioned earlier. It is integrated with the broader development agendas, with the government's food security program, the 10-year development program, and as other programs working in environment protection and climate change, including the climate resilience green economy. It uses community-level mechanism because communities are involved in targeting beneficiaries and promoting local accountability and development. One other area, it demonstrates importance of integrating environment and climate change mitigation adaptation activities through the public workers, engaging in different activities of communities. These are some of the lessons we can draw from the program. Maybe I have one last slide.
Shall we stop here?
Okay.
I know it has been fascinating. I think already 17 minutes, but I think there's a lot to unpick and discuss, and we maybe continue after the Q&A. But also, I'm sure you will be asked many questions. I want to thank you so much for the presentation. I think it's a great example of how a government can decide to align poverty objective with long-term climate change objectives, and it can be done. It's also increasing the government commitment to this type of program, even in the context of decreasing and low tax to GDP revenue. And I know in Ethiopia, they are working hard to try to see how to improve tax to GDP ratio to have more funds to deliver this type of program. So thank you so much. I'm now want to introduce again a bit introduction to our next speaker, Yamina Yar. So as I said, she's the president and chief executive of the Center for Policy Research, where she founded the Accountability Initiative, which is credited with pioneering one of India's largest expenditure tracking surveys for elementary education. Yamina's work sits at the intersection of research and policy practice. Her research interests span the fields of public finance, social policy, state capacity, federalism, governance, and the study of contemporary politics in India. We are delighted to have you here today to talk about the response to the pandemic in India and the role of India's digital public infrastructure in this response. The floor to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a privilege to be here. Um, you know, I think in the contemporary moment when when India comes up in discussions like this, especially on questions of social policy, both from the point of view of our response to the pandemic as well as sort of larger shifts that are taking place in how we think about social safety nets. There's no getting away from digitization. That's without a doubt one of the most visible elements of the safety net system or the welfare state architecture that is being put into place in India. And in and of itself, it's quite dazzling in terms of what it's seeking to achieve. It is seeking to sort of universalize access to the financing system through by creating bank accounts for everybody, and it is through a process of a fairly complex payment pipeline has created effectively the mechanism for what we call in India direct benefit transfer. So cash that can directly be cut through the layers of the administrative architecture and drop straight into beneficiary bank accounts. And this is one of the most well-known elements of what India has built. It's been core to how we have projected our safety net system. It's been core to the G20 dialogue and digital payment infrastructures. And it's widely sort of projected as, in some ways, holding all the elements of what we call good governance, responsive fiscal targeting policies, in that these cut-through layers of administration. So in the Indian lexicon, there used to be a statement made by our Prime Minister in the 1980s that out of 1 rupee that goes from the central government coffers down to the village, 80 paisa of it is eaten up by the administration along the way, both in administrative costs as well as in corruption. And now we have sort of produced this fantastic system that bypasses this dysfunctional, corrupt state, drops money directly into everybody's bank accounts. And you see these dazzling numbers that flash on various government websites and MIS systems that tell you how much money is being saved by virtue of all of this. The reason I'm not presenting a slide with all these fantastic numbers is because these are numbers. We don't actually have a census yet in India. We don't have, our statistical system has not updated its surveys on consumption expenditure. So we don't have a sense of where we are in terms of shifts in poverty. So, but we do know that infrastructure has been built. There's no denying that. We also know that politicians love it. You just have to look at the manifestos of every political party to know that direct cash transfers now is very much part and parcel of the set of electoral offerings. So there is hot electoral competition around this. And I would venture so much as to say, don't kill me, everybody in this room, but politicians know quite well what goes on the ground, much better perhaps than all of us over here with our sophisticated tools to evaluate. So probably something is happening. But beyond that, I can't say. And that's the broad structure in which the safety net story of India has unfolded. There's a structure in place. It may work, it may not work. It's your bias versus mine. And so what I thought I would do in the few minutes I have here is to just present to you, instead of a sort of litany of all the things that we have done, given the absence of data, a set of provocations around what it means to actually have a digital infrastructure for us to think a little bit harder about, because I think they have significant implications on questions of social safety nets and on questions of responsive fiscal targeting. So let me present three to you. The first, and they all intersected, and I think for me what matters most, I think, in all of this is the underlying political economy that is shaping this welfare architecture that we are building, and I think we need to be very cognizant of it, especially when we allow for the discourse to almost be taken over by frameworks of efficiency, of good governance, of corruption. Ultimately, these are all deeply political acts, and we need to be, when we're talking about social safety nets, we're essentially talking about that which goes to the most marginalized, and I don't think that there's any way of getting around the politics. It should be front and center. So let me say three things. One, who is targeted is in and of itself a deeply political act. It is an act of complex political negotiation, of interests competing with each other, and of politics striking forms of compromise that inevitably give more, depending on the nature of the politics, inevitably give more value to some voices and others. And it's in the interstices of this tension that the nature of who gets targeted is sort of built in. I think one of the really interesting things about technology is that in some ways it can blunt precisely that competition. Now, you could argue that that's a really good thing because it essentially allows you to go down the road of universal targeting in some senses. It cuts out vested interests and elite capture that has always been one of the big challenges with any kind of targeting. But at the same time, it raises very important questions about what is the core purpose of your welfare architecture. So if your core purpose of the welfare architecture, which in social democratic context in the Western world essentially was very closely integrated with the labor market. So it comes out with so it begins with a sort of full employment imagination and ensuring that you are able to provide a certain kind of safety net to those who don't have the ability to access full employment, whether it is maternity, injury, pensions, all of those elements come in. And over time, as full employment from the golden era of welfareism here in Europe, unemployment starts becoming part and parcel of the structure. Addressing, at least temporarily, the unemployment problem also becomes quite central to the framework of the welfare architecture. Now, in countries like India, employment, or rather the tensions between capital and labor, are not the front and center framework in which the welfare architecture is being built. It is primarily about providing safety nets to the informal economy that is mostly invisible from the entire economic and state architecture. And it is about being able to provide the right kind of safety nets there. But when you take away the negotiations and the jostling between interest groups, the real question is, what is it? So if it's going to be, which is essentially what it is now in India, a quasi-universal welfare structure. Now, in and of itself, normatively, that may not be a bad thing at all, but it raises a very important fiscal question, because basically, essentially, you're giving safety nets to almost 80% of your population. And when it gets divorced from any questions of employment, you're not going to be generating revenue directly linked to the kind of welfare structure that you're building. So how do you actually manage responsive fiscal targeting in this kind of scenario? And given the nature of the politics around it, you will inevitably, once you launch a scheme, it's going to be very difficult to walk away from it. Now, in the days before we had, I guess my first provocation then is, and I don't have any good answers. I'm just, in the business of provoking, and hopefully you'll all tell me how to think about this. But I guess one question is, can you, in the world of of technology, which allows you to cut through the kind of coalition building and jostling of interests, actually have fiscally responsive safety nets? You will essentially be mostly in a universal structure. And when you're not actively addressing the question of employment, at least in countries like ours, where you still aren't taxing at the level at which you can for a young economy that should be actually in the formal marketplace, how and in what form are you going to generate that revenue? So how do you balance out questions of revenue generation with fiscally responsive? So in a sense, you basically have an expenditure policy that's very much about safety nets, but it's divorced entirely from your revenue raising imagination completely. The second element of this is centralization. By design, technology is a deeply centralizing feature. Now, again, you could argue that that's a good thing. It cuts out the layers of decentralized chaos. But one of the elements of that centralization is it essentially takes the state very, very far away from where all the action is. And when you take the state very, very far away from where all the action is, from the point of view of fiscally responsive targeting, you actually have a harder time figuring out how to create a how to pay pipeline or who to pay pipeline than you would in the old chaos, where there would be actually tangible physical sites of engagement between beneficiaries and the state where there would be jostling. So, there's a lot of very nice documentation of how in an extremely ineffective, deeply corrupt, lots of elite capture structure of local governance in India, the real contestation in public meetings between the local governments and citizens was around who could enter the below poverty list in order to be able to access benefits. That was a public process. It was not, I'm not romanticizing it at all. It was deeply contextual. Structured inequalities meant that there was always elite capture, but there was bargaining, actual physical bargaining. What a digital structure has done is that it has converted that bargaining process into a database. You are in the database or you are not in the database. And it has also taken away the power of negotiation at the grassroots site where contestation takes place, because the database is controlled very far away. So what the local government officer gets is basically a document where they can cross-verify attributes of individuals that are to be targeted for a program. They can delete, but they cannot include, because the minute you open up the space for including, too much politics comes in the way, and that becomes a problem. So we don't allow inclusion, we allow a lot of deletion, but it takes away sites of contestation, because these are actually hotly contested sites. After all, you are essentially dealing with extreme poverty and poverty, which basically means for 6 months, if I have a job, I'm able to purchase a particular asset, and I lose my job, and so I lose my wages, and I no longer have that asset, and I've fallen back into poverty. It's a very, very fluid process. So I can be in and out of that list very quickly. But there is no space where I can actually present my grievance, because the system is so centralized, and the power and authority of decision making is actually going away from the front line to a server very, very far away. It's like the kind of frustrations we feel when you're calling up the call centers to try and get your credit card unblocked or anything. And it's all, you're always put on hold, and you'll get that repeat message. So what happens when, through the process of digitization, you essentially convert a very contested process of politics, which is targeting, into a centralized system? It may give you fiscal responsiveness, but it begs the question of whether the state is actually reaching where it should, and what the purpose of the targeting effectively is. And the last point I'll make, I know I've overshot, the last point I'll make is that we also need to be cognizant of, and I mean, technology is always an aid, it's not a solution, but we do need to be cognizant of the fact that in a very complex place where the world finds itself, where personalized politics, even in democratic settings, is the norm, the ability of technology to personalize and centralize politics itself is extremely powerful and significant. We talk about it a lot in the context of social media. We don't talk about it in the context of what social safety nets and technology can in combine do. It essentially brings the leader that is transferring cash to you very directly into your home. And the reason why this is an important question for democracy is that it comes back to the fundamental political science questions of patron-client relationships, role of social safety nets in terms of its responsive welfare state's responsibility towards citizens versus welfare state's responsibility to as a sort of charity or patronage that is given. So when you move into a very personalized form of politics of social safety nets, it does in fact take away, I feel, from the core element of citizenship. It sort of becomes very much about a very transactional, patronage-oriented contract between politician and voter, and therefore raises very important questions for how do we think about safety nets and democracy. So these are just provocations. In the end, if the goal is to ensure that there is cash that is delivered to citizens, the digital infrastructure perhaps is far more efficient than the old days of grassroots contestation, which often got monies into the wrong hands. But at the same time, whilst we are building this extremely efficient structure, we need to be very cognizant of the larger politics that shapes it, because ultimately it is the larger politics that will enable the effectiveness of the use of this and ensure that it is genuinely fiscally responsive and not just a big fiscal sort of giveaway that 20 years down the line, the next generation is scratching its heads over.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Well, fascinating as well. Very different to Ethiopia, clearly nearly almost universal system and not so targeted, even if digitalized. And I guess that's a social preference, social contracts, political issues, whether it's linked or not to the labor market, I think, and whether that relates to tax payment and tax morale. It's something that is very cultural and social and potentially quite specific as well to India. And I guess tax evasion or informality is an issue across the income distribution and not only for those that receive these cash transfers, but let's discuss a bit more later. And so I will now introduce, just give the floor to Mike Bracken. I will mention again, he's a partner at Public Digital. He's a public sector technology leader who was a founder and executive director of the UK Government Digital Service. He's a global digital leader also who has led wholesale transformations of large institutions in the private and public sector in different countries around the world. And we have asked Mike to discuss the potential of data, digital capabilities, and new institutional arrangements to bring policy and delivery together, and the dangers associated with these capabilities, and how can this be mitigated. So over to you.
Thanks, Laura. 1 minute, 2 minutes? Yeah.
I will put the timer again, but I've been less strict than I thought I was going to be anyway. You are all too fascinating.
Yes, well, thank you for that introduction. I'm delighted to be here. Thanks to the ODI for helping us and supporting public digital. First, I should say that the two examples we've just heard, particularly the sort of on-the-ground example with cash transfer in Ethiopia, and reasonably familiar with your colleagues in India and Aadhaar and everything else, and social parts of it. That's one of the reasons we do this job and why the digital government is so fascinating, because it has a real profound effect on people. There's an awful lot of things we can discuss, and I think the Q&A will be richer, but I'm just going to firstly just introduce Public Digital. We're a consultancy, work with 40 plus governments around the world, all over the world, colleagues all over the world, and we're 65% female. Sadly, you get me today, I'm female. And we work with sort of big funders, Gates and others around the world. So these projects and this sort of issues, such as sort of the effects of technology on governance, are sort of our sweet spot. I want to start with a provocation, which is, according to Standish Group research, which some of you might be familiar with, IT-based programs in governments fail 83% of the time. 83%. Why do we keep doing that? We've been doing that now for 25 years, and we are addicted to failure. So I sit on the board of a bank. I advise 3 of the world's global development banks. I've got a finance background. So I sometimes have to have, why are we still talking about this stuff? So I want to sort of give a provocation, really. And I think that one of the reasons I've learned in my career, and as I say, as someone who's made many mistakes, we've not got enough time to talk about all the mistakes I've made today, is abstraction. And I talk to government units around the world, particularly in finance and economics ministries, making big decisions around capital flows, around investments, around technology-based delivery. And the problem is, time and again, is abstraction. Now, today has been great because the example, PSNP in Ethiopia, the real world issues of society, democracy and governance in India, they are real examples. But too often, I think, many of the decisions that we make about how to try and solve those problems, we are so far abstracted from the real experience of people. You mentioned this about politicians having a closer grasp. And I think that that's one of the problems that bedevils us. With public digital, with the ODI, we wrote a paper, it's on the website. We identified 6 continuous problems in finance and economics ministries that really show this abstraction. They are a reliance on off-the-shelf technology, often just not fit for purpose, but it's easy to buy. Not really understanding user needs. We understand our government needs much more than the needs of people who actually want to use stuff. We have an unfailing belief in the success of big bang IT projects, despite 83% of them failing all the time. We're often bereft of the digital skills we need in our own governments. Our funding models for these programs often are not set up for success. Funding models can be over sort of 10 plus years in some cases, great to be funded, but actually it needs a degree of science fiction to believe in the outcomes that you're going to get. And 6 is an unfailing belief that the sunk costs we've spent on failure must be maintained. That legacy technology that's failed that we need like lots more licenses for that technology. Now those 6 things are eminently sortable, but the question for me is why don't we sort them out? Because I set up the government digital service in the UK with some of my colleagues here. I won't go on about that, very boring, but it was done as a response to crisis. The UK had fundamentally failed. £12 billion on NHS IT system didn't work. Tax, borders, justice, big IT had failed. It failed recently in Australia. In Commonwealth countries, it fails all the time. Australia recently with its tax system. I could go around the world. And so the government digital service was really an attempt to try something different. We set roughly a model about focusing on user needs, working in small teams, multidisciplinary teams, having small amounts of finance to test and build rapidly and continue to change your services as to how people are actually using them, not to how policy dictates you would like to use them. That model, by and large, has led to about 350 digital units around the world at the moment. Some are cosmetic, some are marketing-led, some are political, but many of them have this way of working at their heart. And the fundamental challenge, I think, is how do we as a community of finance and economic policy people and delivery people come together to harness that, because we're still doing the big IT failure thing too often. And these programs, not yours, but these types of programs are simply too important to be left to that. I think there's a number of things we can do. And so be very positive. There's a number of sort of no regret things. And I'm not picking on any country here because some of them will have done already. We spend a lot of time in different countries. Firstly, have a service-oriented finance ministry. Now, how are you set up? Finance and economics together, separate, doesn't matter. Too often I go to countries and ask some very simple, I asked these questions when I came to UK government. How many services do we have? People go, that's a good one. You better ask the ministries. And I'm like, okay, well, we're funding them. So how much are we spending on them? Oh, that's a difficult one. It's over a number of years. How many people use them today? What does success look like? How many people applied for a passport, got a driving license? These are very simple data flows. Without them, how on earth can we judge the value and efficacy of our spending? The data flows that we should have are not particularly advanced. They're just telling us what people are actually doing. I'm going to pick on Laura here, not pick on Laura, but I'm going to pick on Laura. We share a similar experience in Argentina, if you're from Argentina. And Argentina, as you know, has had many economic crises. I work with the Argentinian government, and those macroeconomic crises about lending, IMF, put them to one side. Because when I walk around Buenos Aires and other places in Argentina, which I do with my friends, and I spent a sabbatical there, not one person in Argentina talked to me about the policies of the government. Not one. What they talked about was they couldn't get a driving license, the tax thing didn't work, this didn't work. They talk almost all the time about services. And the experience of people in government, the thing that damages democracy at the end of the day and trust in government is not bad policy. It is the service delivery as a result of that policy that's not being delivered. And a focus on services, what is actually happening today, is crucial, I think, for finance and economics ministries. And too often, I spend time with colleagues in those ministries who go, well, I've got a very big brain and I couldn't, actually get involved in the detail of what the government does, but I would like to write a long-term paper on its long-term macroeconomic positioning. And that needs doing, but not without understanding the service mix and service model. So number one, get hold of the service data. Number two, put those digital units or those skills, however you structure them in government, relatively rare skills, product management, user research, these things that we've not really paid attention to, put them as close to the source of money as you can. Right? They are the tool. We took 4.1 billion out of the 16 billion spend in the UK. So we made better services, happier users for 25% less of cost, and the money just fell out the bottom. It's not difficult. You need to put those people not in some distant department or project, put them right where the money is. This is really hard for the next one, really hard for finance people to understand. It's not about CapEx. Our commitment to CapEx and sort of long-term IT spending, it's great because we work on spreadsheets and we have a budget to meet and the finance minister wants to know, but this, that and the other, but it leads to false certainty. So when I came to government, people said, we spent X billion or millions on this thing and it doesn't work. And on my iPad, and I say, I know, because you spent it 5 years before iPads were invented. It just took that long to be delivered. Like, you can't keep predicting the future with large scale capital flows. We don't know what the future user experience of digital services changes so rapidly. We have got to be a much more focused and thoughtful and put our money in our OPEX in relatively small groups of people that can deliver quickly at scale. Look at Togo. Anyone here from Togo? Please, anyone? No? Sina Lawson, Togo. The story of the coronavirus response. Togo, excuse my ignorance, like down the order of Gini coefficients we would expect, all the problems, 8 million people, digital currency within 3 weeks from COVID response. Health data records nationally, all women head of households delivered in, I think, about 4 weeks. Astonishing digital response. Why? You got digital skills, OPEX, no big capital program, get some money to those people quickly. That's the way to do it. That's very hard for a finance and economics people to understand. It's not, digital change isn't really about long-term capital investments. It's about short-term skills and giving those people relatively small amounts of money to make services. Last one, I could go on, but I won't because I'm very boring. Technology is a centralizing function. I really, you've struck on something that is so fundamental, I think, and I don't want to, I agree with you, but there's a caveat to your sentence, which is only because we have chosen it to be. In the 1960s and 70s and 80s, if you look at enterprise technology, the idea of big companies that you all know, Oracle, Microsoft, all these big companies, what they essentially said to governments were, as the sphere of government gets bigger and you want to do more things, welfare, pensions, transport, whatever, you can't keep expanding the people in government forever. We're going to give you a deal. We're going to give you this deal. We're going to say, have our technology and you will retain control. And it's such a compelling deal, I think. And it leads to government to this day going, if I just have one big contract, if I have one big outsource deal, one big supplier, everything will be fine. The jury is in 83% of the time that doesn't work. The risk always comes back to the government. The government always picks up the tab. What India is doing at the moment with enterprise technology is so interesting because you've got Aadhaar, you've got hundreds of million people connected to the state, KYC, and yet the perception of, on the reality of lack of local control. I would say it doesn't have to be like that. Those systems can just as easily empower local people to have that conversation. They've just not chosen to do that. They've chosen enterprise rather than internet era technology. And I think the thing that all of governments around the world have got to sort of sort of go into sort of rehab about is that enterprise technology doesn't give control. It leads to rent-seeking arrangements, it leads to failure, and too often not, it leads to a lack of political participation and trust. It is damaging in the long term to democracy or to democratic engagement. And I think that's a very hard lesson for governments to learn. And it does require us to go around and say, all this sunk cost that we're carrying around, we're just going to have to let that go. That's a tough lesson for anyone. So it's not my money, so I can say that, but I think I'll leave it there, and hopefully that's enough provocation. But I would like to say thank you to the speakers, because you're actually on the ground doing like God's own work in terms of programs. And if we can help, if digitalization can help you achieve better outcomes and actually help your funders to see what you're doing more, then it's got to be worth doing differently.
Thank you, Mike. Thanks so much. So thanks again to all our speakers, and now for the fun part again, some Q&A. So yeah, please raise your hands. We can take 3-4 questions and then, yeah.
Hello. So Nicholas Wan, Swiss Think. Just for the last speaker, I'm very curious, how do we define success or failure for these systems? How do we know which ones have failed and which ones have succeeded? What is the criteria?
Great question. Do you want to take that?
I think, yeah, a few, and then we, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, is that okay?
So to clarify, how do I
Yeah.
do it, or how does this?
Yeah. Here. Okay.
Is it on? Yeah. Thank you. Sorry. Paulo D'Erenzio from FGV in Brazil. I want to come back to the example of Togo. I mean, I remember reading about it and being so fascinated by it, and you only gave a very quick account of why it worked. My question is really why. I mean, it was such an easy, quick win. They made it work so quickly and so effectively. Why didn't it happen anywhere else? What's your sense of that? Thanks.
Thank you for the great presentation. A question for the speakers from India and Ethiopia. In terms of the performance of these policies, are you monitoring some performance indicators other than the volume of cash that has been delivered? And if that is the case, which ones? Thank you.
Thank you very much. This is Andy Silabest from Capri. I've got the first question is more on the first speaker about the Ethiopia story. I think my interest is more generally on sustainability of these programs, perhaps rather than having what I can call perpetual dependence, and perhaps how, if there's anything that is planned for that. And then for the India case, I think my interest is more on the input or source databases, the credibility of the information that is used in order to then decide who should benefit or who should not benefit. I think I took note of your point of political influence or even infiltration of decisions on which beneficiary would make it or not into the targeting there, and perhaps whether there is any element of beneficiary participation, whether it is at a policy decision level or to decide on how or what criteria is used to decide on beneficiaries that would benefit. I think I'm interested in the ownership of the citizens in what the country is doing. I think just to comment on the last speaker on one of the points, and I also, my colleague behind me here asking about the issue, the failure or success. One of the critical things that we should always note when it comes to IT systems, let's not think of IT being a solution to everything, but just know that whatever problem that you have, then the solution must be talking to that particular problem. If you were not able to then know how you are working or how you are doing the manual work or processing of whatever that you did, chances are the IT will not be your solution if you can't even scope, even manually, your own challenges. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think we give the speakers a chance to answer this round of questions, and then we take some more. So, Mike, do you want to?
Standish Group is the research you're looking for. There are very clear definitions of success and failure. I think they do it every year. 83 was the worst year. It's improved a bit, but you take the point. So have a look at theirs. My definition, they don't track the right thing, in my opinion, not all the right things. For governments generally, cost per transaction. What does it cost to deliver not the cost of a driving license, but the delivery of that, one per transaction? Once you understand cost per transaction, governments massively overpay on service delivery, usually by a factor of 10. So it's very, very cheap. Completion percentage. IT programs, to the gentleman's point, can say, well, we've delivered our IT, the thing may be unusable. It's like, how many people start an interaction with government, maybe just for information, and actually finish? Because that's even worse. When you don't finish, you just create failure waste. Someone else in the system has to go and tidy it up and everything else. That is, there's a multiplier of waste. Usually about 40% of bureaucratic activity is managing waste, created by not doing it right the first time. If you get it right the first time, huge amounts of money fall out. And having a metric for failure waste is really important. But have a look at Standish Group. Togo, why did they do it well? They're not the only one. They're an extremely good example. But crisis response to COVID, there's an almost perfect correlation. My colleague James Stewart did a little piece of work at the time, where you have a multidisciplinary team using relatively open technology and data, so not big procurement licenses that take ages, where they have skills for product management, information delivery, and whether at the center of the government, the COVID response in that country was generally much better. Togo is at the top of the list. Why were they so good? They'd had SARS and MERS, so they have some experience. They have a fantastic leader, Gina Lawson, who has the ability to just cut through structure of government. So it's managing crisis rather than managing up and down in departmental lines. And crucially, to your point, is the data service and the flows was a small part of it. It's about being aligned with people on the ground who are delivering service. Because technology-based programs that sit in isolation rarely work anyway. So I think Togo is worth checking out.
Thank you so much. So I would give the floor to Fernando to discuss performance indicators and also sustainability.
Okay, thank you. These are actually two good questions on performance measurement and sustainability. The program actually from the beginning, we're starting from the designing of the program, it has a very rigorous M&E system. And both donor and the government conduct biannual reviews on the program. They have even they go to the ground where the beneficiaries are locating. Then they do a biannual review on the performance of the program. And that's a very interactive and engaged both the development partners and the government. On sustainability, yeah, that is the issue is an important issue, sustainability. Actually, the program has tried to promote graduation from the program, and the component of the public work is assumed to build sustainability. That means it's related with the development activities of the country. Then that development activity or engaging the community with the public work is assumed to build to increase the adaptation and mitigation of the crisis. Then it has sustainability. In addition to that, actually, in addition to the PSNP program, also the government uses the other fiscal policy measures in addressing shocks. And overall, that there is this component of increasing and promoting sustainability of the program. Thank you.
Sure. So I think, so two questions. One on what is being tracked. So, I mean, we have fairly sophisticated administrative databases that are tracking broadly the movement of money and all the attributes around the basis on which the targeting takes place. So different schemes have different attributes. What is missing, I think, is the state capacity to actually draw on these data systems, because it is a fairly sophisticated set of processes of analytical capability, and analyze and understand who is being targeted, what is the nature of exclusion, etc. And also within that, build it into the administrative system's capability to respond. That's a very fundamental state capacity question of where power and decision making rests within the chain of command of the administration. And certainly in the Indian administrative system, it is extremely centralized in terms of decision making power. Accountability is very much defined as a process of accounting, not a process of actually working towards a particular set of objectives. So that kind of creates greater incentives to use technology to centralize the entire process. So I mean, to Mark's point, I agree that technology is as centralizing as you want it to be, but it enables that centralization in a way in which a culture of centralization facilitates that. What we don't have at this point in time are good evaluations, either third-party evaluations, at least none that I have seen, or for that matter, the capacity of the Indian statistical system to produce large-scale evaluation data that gives you a sense of what the impact of all of this is on consumption patterns, on income, on, obviously the big questions of poverty. And for that, we have to wait for census so that there's comparable data, and our consumption expenditure survey, which is what we use to understand poverty. So those are things we don't have and we don't know. It goes back, I guess, in some ways to this question of ownership. Given the popularity of direct benefit transfers, and don't forget that popularity of direct benefit transfers in India is coming at a time when both we have built up the technology, and we see that technology is very much part of the state building process, as well as a larger, very structural constraint in the Indian economy, in that it's growing in a way that is simply not able to produce jobs that are available to all, right? So in some senses, rather than dealing with these very fundamental structural questions, if you look at our labor data, you see that India has this very unique, since 2017 actually, reversal of structural transformation, as agriculture suddenly has become the primary employer, more so than manufacturing and services in India. And so it gives you a bit sense of what is actually happening within the labor market and the extent to which unemployment crisis is really a serious crisis. And in that context, the direct benefit transfers as a way of enabling consumption smoothing becomes a very popular tool. So there is ownership in that. It is politically recognized as an important thing, and politically, and to the extent that politics responds to signals of voters, there is a degree of ownership. When it actually comes to the determination of how you design the inclusion criteria, who you target and in what form and how, that has become an extremely technocratic, bureaucratic exercise. For instance, in one state in which we work, they've defined 6 eligibility criteria that are basically an administrative set of criteria, and then the administrative system along with the database sort of works through those to identify which households fit within that category and which don't. And what I meant in terms of sites of contestation being closed down is if you think you fit within that 6 sets of eligibility criteria, there is no local community meeting where these can be negotiated. And even if there is a local community meeting, there is no local power or authority that rests with the local government or local administrator to take that decision. At best, it can be passed on to the higher levels of the bureaucratic structure to be able to take those decisions. And so it's we call it grievance redress. I don't like that word because I think it's a lot more than just that. It's after all, entry into government systems or entry into social safety nets is to my mind a deeply political exercise and has everything to do with how vulnerable and marginalized citizens are able to express and assert their voice.
Thank you so much. I have used my chair privileges to just ask a follow-up question. So you say you don't have census data, you don't have survey data, but the state has admin data to decide across the whole population who gets who meets the criteria or doesn't. So it's like a bit like, can you explore further?
Right? Now it starts getting complicated. So subnational governments, state governments collect data in some way for particular sets of programs. Some states have done what we call socioeconomic caste census and build up their own databases. Others do other things. There are different types of administrative data that are used, electricity usage. Do you have, for different schemes and programs, numbers are, unique identities are given, cards are given. Do you sit within the database for the public distribution system for free food? That would suggest that you were, so different kinds of administrative databases are created within silos. Technically speaking, and colleagues in this room will be much better at explaining all of this, but the Aadhaar number sort of it becomes a foundation on the basis of which all these different kinds of identity are provided. So technically speaking, this data can be interoperable and can be used to come up with some ways of cross verification to ensure that eligibility criteria are verified. But to the extent that there is actually a large-scale third-party verification through data, and the extent to which we can draw on data to evaluate impact, and administrative data also has to be constantly verified, both by academics, but also by citizens. It needs to be in the public domain in order to ensure it's not garbage in, garbage out.
No,
So
it's just like to make the point that clearly it's a political decision, like not to have
not
this
to do our census.
census and a
we are
household
20
survey to try to evaluate of these
yeah,
things.
yeah.
And we come
Yeah,
back to
yeah,
the
yeah, yeah, yeah,
political
yeah,
economy of
yeah,
things,
yeah,
but yeah,
absolutely, yeah.
just more questions to the floor.
Yeah, but I actually have question to all the panelists, because the thing is with government, I think the country's context matter when it comes to digitalization. And the success of Togo emerged from the fact that they had a verification system, a digital verification system that identify individuals, more or less that anyone can easily be identified, and of course it's easier to make any policy. Now, for governments, especially at the center, they always embark on giant projects that talks to each other. For instance, if I'm a minister of finance and I'm making allocation, I need to also have a system that has interoperability, that can speak with perhaps the banks, the banking system, and of course the central bank or the accountant general. So such kind of system required actually giant projects to be able to execute. Otherwise, there is tendency to be failure or some kind of hacking system or something that will affect the security of the system. So those considerations are always given in terms of government. We have introduced what we call a bank verification system in Nigeria. And the idea of the BVN is to identify serial defaulters in the banking system. And it is a giant project, but it is very successful and it has worked. And in fact, we are replicating it in the entire West Africa, such that if someone is an investor or perhaps takes money from a system, it can easily be identified in any part of West Africa. So those kind of peculiarities also comes into play when it comes to implementation of government policies. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, yeah, one here. Yeah, many.
Yeah, it's just an addition to this, really, that Mike Bracken spoke about enterprise systems kind of being Voldemort in this world. But surely, national payment systems, payroll systems, which do redistribute power to the center, are necessary as well in certain spaces.
David Nabena with the NGF, Nigeria Governance Forum. I think my question is also linked with theirs as well. What is the scope of private sector data in informing initially from the design stage or even at the measurement stage in bridging some of the gap, right? In India, she mentioned census and even household surveys, GDP data, there are usual lags, quarterly, yearly. How can we use private sector data to close some of the gaps in design stage and even in checking the service impact and outcomes?
Yeah. So let's here. Can you introduce quickly yourself, please?
Hi, David Rosenfeld, Research Associate at ODI. I had a question about what you think all of this means for finance ministries, both in terms of their organization and recruitment of, the type of people you have there. Because, in a lot of places, I think finance ministries tend to be places where they like to formulate policy. They're not necessarily operational and around sort of so obvious service delivery. So a lot of the digital specialists, for example, in the UK, will be in places like in HMRC for tax and work in pensions, things like that. But Treasury itself, that recruits people who like to design the policies and think, and centralize, a lot of decision making. What does that mean in terms of the kind of skills that you want there, or what does it mean in terms of the power that you want to give to the finance ministry long term? I don't know, this is probably a bit vague, but.
Good question. One last question. Well, two, and two there, and we close.
Hi, Viraj Tyagi from EGA Foundation. I think the conversation on digitalization as a force of centralization is very interesting. And I think in a way, digitization itself, is it that it's a force for centralization, or has it been politicized to become a force? I think that's the question in my mind, because a lot of times the design of technology now looks at, it's very easy to do decentralization with multi-tenanted architectures and all those things, right? But given the funding, given where the power sits, it gets politicized and keeps moving up and up and up. So I think that is the question. I know, Mike, you said from a technology point of view, it's very easy to decentralize. But when you look at GovTech, it again becomes a bit of a political act. So I would love to hear some more views on that.
Thank you. And last one here.
Thank you. Good morning, Andrew Lawson from Fiscus. I worked with Otto van Hoon and his colleagues on the PSMP, and I think you were actually a little bit too modest about what the PSMP has achieved. Most of us in the UK still remember the periods of droughts of the 1980s, and how in the 1980s and 90s, drought inevitably turned into famine. And what the PSMP has succeeded in doing is avoiding famine. There have not been famines, I think, for many years now. And it also covers 8 million people full-time, growing to 12 million in times of needs. So that's approximately 10% of the population. And in terms of unit costs of transfer, it's one of the most efficient transfer systems in the world. But I wanted to ask a question about the next stage. And one of the things that's happening is to try to move to a more digitalized system of transfer. And they're using what they call electronic payments, but because a lot of the beneficiary households don't have bank accounts, they have what they call development agents in the local banks that then distribute money to the households, which obviously has problems of inefficiency and potentially corruption, although there doesn't seem to be much problem of corruption, at least it's not reported. They are also trialing systems using mobile bank money. So what the Ethiopians call e-bir, which is similar to M-Pesa in Kenya and Tanzania. So I was wondering, how the trialing of mobile payments is working, whether there's some thinking about a shift towards that, and also perhaps the other speakers might comment in terms of decentralization as well. Is it better to be getting your payment on your phone? And also, Mike, what sort of experience you have comparing e-payments through banks versus mobile money solutions?
Thank you. So, Fantahu, do you mind starting?
Okay, thank you. I think I agree with considering the country context. In fact, how using the digitalization on money transfer and the others. The Ethiopia is actually it's a very big and wide country. Infrastructure is not that much developed. It's being that, and now I think currently the government opens for other telecom companies, but previously there was only one national telecom company. Now it's open for the others, and it's being actually expanded. And yes, then within that context, you have to think the expansion of the digital payment and others within that context. Yes, Andrew, as you mentioned, I think the program is trying to expand or to do the transfers through electronic payments, and using that with the bank transfers. But in some areas, bank services still is not accessible. It depends actually on the expansion of the infrastructure. But the government is pushing to use mobile banking and non-cash transfers and non-cash transactions. It means that, as I said, also the new telecom company, the private telecom company, is allowed to engage in money transfers. That is also one addition for the expanding as long as there is a competition between the two, at least between the two companies, the service will be improved and expanded. Then that will be an opportunity for the program to use electronic banking, e-payment, and others. That is the intention toward this promoting or using e-payment and automated transfers for the beneficiaries. As you said, it will reduce the transaction cost, maybe also the corruption and other related issues. That's very important. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So I think there were other questions related to whether you need giant enterprises systems or not, or an interoperability, and how this also relates to centralization, decentralization dynamic of the system interaction with users. So Yamini, do you want to comment on that in the context of India, and then you can comment in the context of many countries, and also answer the question in terms of what it means for Ministry of Finance as well and the Treasury here? Yeah.
Well, I mean, on the centralization, decentralization issue, I agree. It is ultimately technology is a tool, and it's a matter of how and where it's deployed. India has always played this tug of war. And I don't know that that's necessarily unique to India, between degrees of centralization and degrees of decentralization. But I think what is unique perhaps to some degree in India is that the problem of service delivery was very much framed as a problem of excessive discretion and lack of accountability at the front lines of where service delivery actually takes place. And in more ways than one, I mean, the sort of framework of why is it that we are not able to ensure that, food for work programs or cash for work programs actually deliver benefits? Why are we not able to ensure that teachers show up to schools? Why are we not able to ensure that health centers actually, the works, right? And a lot of that was, is attributed, not completely for wrong reasons, to the nature of the grassroots state, the degrees of discretion, and the degrees of discretion deployed very much in terms of being entrenched in a patronage, a state society dynamic that essentially delivers to vested interests of elites and not vested interests to all, or not interests of all. And it's in that context that sort of technology comes in as a sort of magic bullet possibility. And it's framed in an understanding of a problem as something that needs to take away discretion from the front lines in order to be able to deliver well. That's the problem. So to me, actually, I guess the right way to frame this is technology can be centralizing. And in a state structure where the state society dynamic or the state society compact around accountability is very much a compact of accountability framed as curbing discretion. And I mean, yesterday there were a couple of IAS officers from India in the room. I don't see them here today, but they will completely disagree with me. Curbing discretion is in their minds at the heart of what we need to do. And I believe that flies in the face of a lot of evidence that we do have in India, where you actually see robust decentralization. States like Kerala, Lekha is here, she studied this more than most. You actually are able to demonstrate the most powerful kinds of effective service delivery, where technology then becomes deployed as a useful tool that cuts transaction costs, that improves transparency, all the good, cool things that technology does. When technology is deployed in a vacuum of a broken state, which has generated a politics of accountability that is about discretion curbing, that's when the worst of its predatory and centralizing tendencies can come to the fore. And all I'm trying to say is that in the discourse of efficiency and good governance, let's not forget what that can do. There are trade-offs. There's a trade-off between the messiness of grassroots democratic accountability and the clean efficiency of what a DBT can do or what digitization can do. And we'll have to learn to live with a little bit of both. But we're not having that conversation enough. I guess that's why I wanted to sort of throw that in as a provocation. Otherwise, you will always hear the really great stories of this massive digital transformation that has taken place. And it is, and it's also worth asking, by the way, how is it that a country that has still not been able to invest well in high quality schools and education? We talked a lot yesterday about human capital investments, and India has failed routinely at that, even though it produces some of the best engineers in the world. How is it that we were able to do this massive technology transformation and we still can't do those two things? It's politics, but it's also very much about how that politics has shaped our understandings of the state and what we invest.
Thank you so much. Okay, sovereign answer and very insightful. Over to you, Mike.
Thanks. There's a lot of questions, so let me try and answer them directly. I am delighted that your giant program is working really well. I hope when you talk about giant, you mean the 170 million people plus in Nigeria. 200. Forgive me. We work with Edo State in Benin City, so I only have a small part. So forgive me. I don't know enough about your system, so I don't mean to be provocative. That is a giant population. That is in West Africa, a giant country, and things. It doesn't necessarily mean that the spending on, when I say big IT, doesn't mean like hundreds of millions of pounds on servers and licenses and lock-in vendors. That's the difference. So when I talk about big IT, I don't mean about big outcomes. I mean big capital investments in proprietary technology that lock you into one way of doing something. So I'll give you an example. In the UK, we started a number of platforms. So don't think about a system, interoperability platforms. One of them is called GovUK Pay. One is GovUK Notify. I just looked at the stats on my phone. There's 923 live services on GovUK Pay in this country, 4.1 billion going annually through that. That is if you like, a giant outcome. And yet the team that was on that was about 16 people and with an open standard. And this is the key thing. It's hard for people who've, not yourself, but for people in ministries who've come up with like, I am in government, therefore government is big, therefore I need a big system. It's hard to understand that actually you don't need that. You need a small number of people working on an open standard at scale to drive those outcomes. You need a lot of other things as well. So sometimes big can work, but even NASA and other people don't often work in that big way anyway. So I hope your big outcomes or giant outcomes are more of an open standard. Payroll systems. You need payroll systems. It's sort of the same answer. You just don't need, as we've done in this country, to spend billions of pounds on them all over the place in government. You just need relatively modestly priced ones that work. And it's this ability, this willingness to give away large scale contracts, give away the data in those contracts, not have a pricing model that's understood. The whole thing is opaque, to say the least. And then you say, oh, well, it's not working as well as I hoped it would. The economies of scale, just to digress, technology, commodity type technology, payroll's a good example, for the half-life is about just over 12 months. So if you buy some now, 12 months from now, it should be half the cost, roughly. If you buy hosting from Amazon, roughly, that's a good model. And yet government buys 5 to 10 year contracts for payroll systems and puts an inflationary measure on them, right? That's the difference I'm talking about. So yes, you need those systems, payroll, pay, HR. But if you look around the world, look in Canada, they have something called Phoenix. It's their payroll and HR system. It hasn't worked for a decade. And I think they've just put another 4 billion in to try and get it to work. Like, at what point do you stop digging? In Australia, they have a thing called robo-debt, same problem. So there are many, many examples like this. This is what I'm talking about. Yes, you need a system, but actually what you need is something quite lightweight that can change quite quickly rather than the big IT contract behind it. I've got to come to 2 things. GovTech. GovTech, I have no idea what that means. GovTech is a terrible, terrible phrase because what some people mean by it is it's like the name for the old model of buying big IT, but just with a new name on, right? Doesn't mean anything because tech for gov is like, so what? It's like someone said here earlier, it's like, it's about people, it's about service delivery and so on. Sorry to be so cynical, but I've heard so much about GovTech. It's a really unhelpful place to start, I think. I've got to come to your question. Are you from the UK? Yeah. We could talk about this all day and we're not going to. What does, essentially, from a skills and cultural approach, HMT, you're in Treasury, or were you in Treasury? You're ODI, but it's just not fit for purpose because you're just not hiring people with an understanding and worldview of what can be delivered deliberately. That is a deliberate move. So in the UK, in 2010, help me out, we had the government's flagship policy, the coalition government, was called Universal Credit, massive reform of the benefit system, old Victorian system. All parties agreed has got to be reformed. The policy was, I kid you not, that big. It was 2 ring binders, and it had been written by your colleagues in HMT and DWP. And it said, you know, in the future, this will happen, this one. And then it's like, here you go, deliver that. £500 million later, absolutely zero outcome, ditch the whole thing, right? Now, at that point, a self-aware organization might just say, you know, we might be the problem here, but oh no. Well, let's not in Treasury. I tell you what, the problem is we didn't buy enough big IT, right? So if you ask me, which you have done, like what very politely, what's the magic way of reforming finance ministries? I think we're at the sort of existential question. Like, before we talk about how we change you, let's talk about like, why on earth are you in the position to make these decisions? That's the fundamental problem. Like, I took the under 30s out of the Treasury for a day out. This is true. Like, most of them under 30 with a minder. And I went around there about this number of people. I said, you know, who's on Instagram? Who's this in 2015? Who's on WhatsApp? They're like, what's that? I was like, where do we find you from? Like, do you go out at a weekend? Like, have you got any friends? I'm being first of all, it's like that willingness to have such a narrow approach. Like, I mean, I remember in sort of one of my colleagues from Treasury, I do have friends, I do like that, came over to GDS in the budget renewal and exasperated after universal credit, just said, what are you for? In front of it. I said, modernity. You know, this is like, we live in the internet era. This like, we invented the web 30 years ago. This isn't new. And it was that sort of sense of like, we just don't understand how the world works anymore. And I'm afraid I have got to come to that point where, and I was talking to Laura, like separating finance from trade, macroeconomic theory, macroeconomic views of the world is vital. Much more, I mean, I work with Mariana Mazzucato and others. People thinking that way are fantastically, much better than me, and necessary, but they're not great for in-year financial decisions. I think what technology and what digitization has done is show that these are actually two worlds. And if you co-locate them, I don't think you get the best of either. So you get some great people doing their best, but without the data and without this abstraction, without this connection to real world users. And I think that's the problem. I think there's not a cookie cutter because every country is different, but I think you've got to separate those two things. Here endeth the lecture. There's a lot of pain here.
So we have come to our end. There is, I just want to mention one question line from our managing director from ODI, Ratin Roy, and I think it's very actually related to what you just said. Why is that ICT conspicuously fails to bring efficiency to public service delivery, even in rich countries? Why the UK NHS still sends paper letters to patients, have records that are not interoperable, but it works much better for cash transfers and delivering money to people. I think we have discussed some of these already. So writing that you're online, I hope you are happy with the food for thought we have, and that we actually, I think it is to some extent because of how institutions are organized, a lack of knowledge and dynamism among many of us and people in government, and also political will and decisions. And yeah, we can continue discussing over lunch. Thank you so much to all our speakers and to you.